Imagine this. A man walks into an airport, dressed sharp in a tailored suit. He's not just any traveler, he's someone who has worked hard to get where he is today. For years, he climbed the ladder, built his own company from scratch, and now runs one of the most innovative tech businesses out there. His life revolves around meetings, flights, and making big decisions that impact thousands of people. But today, something happens that no amount of success or preparation could shield him from. It's early morning at the airport in Atlanta, Georgia. The energy is buzzing with passengers rushing to catch their flights. Business travelers are glued to their laptops, families are juggling kids and luggage, and flight announcements echo through the terminal. Our protagonist steps up to the gate for his flight to San Francisco. He's carrying a first-class ticket, a seat he booked weeks ago, because time is precious when you're running a multi-million-dollar company. As he approaches the counter, he hands over his boarding pass and ID, expecting the usual polite nod and wave through. Instead, the gate agent pauses, looks at the ticket, then back at him. There's a flicker of hesitation before she says, "I'm sorry, sir, but it seems there's been a mix-up. Your seat has been reassigned." He frowns confused. "What do you mean?" "I purchased this ticket months ago. It's right here," he says, pointing to the confirmation on his phone. She shrugs apologetically, explaining that the flight is overbooked and they had to move some passengers around. When he presses further, asking why his seat was given away, her tone shifts slightly. "We can offer you a seat in economy," she suggests, as if it's a reasonable compromise. Now let's pause for a second. Imagine being in his shoes. You've worked tirelessly to build a life where you don't have to settle for less. And yet, here you are, standing in front of someone who seems determined to push you into a corner. To make matters worse, other passengers are starting to notice the exchange. Some glance curiously, while others pretend not to look. Either way, the spotlight is on him, and it feels like everyone's watching. The man takes a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knows how these situations can escalate quickly, especially when emotions run high. So he asks politely to speak with a supervisor, hoping for a resolution. The supervisor arrives soon after, clipboard in hand, ready to defuse the situation. But instead of offering a solution, the response is eerily similar to what he heard earlier. "Sir, I'm afraid we don't have any available seats in first class," the supervisor repeats, almost robotically. Then comes the kicker. "If you're unable to comply, we may have to ask you to leave the plane entirely." At this point, the man's frustration boils over. He stares at them, realizing this isn't about logistics or overbooking. It's something deeper, something rooted in prejudice. As much as he tries to keep his composure, he can't ignore the sinking feeling that this wouldn't be happening if he looked different, if his skin color didn't carry assumptions with it. Taking a step back, he pulls out his phone. With quiet determination, he mutters under his breath, "You guys really don't know who you're dealing with." Those words hang in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken consequences. What happens next will change everything for him, for the airline, and for countless others who hear his story. The man stands there, gripping his phone tightly, his mind racing. He knows this isn't just about a seat on a plane, it's bigger than that. It's about respect, fairness, and the kind of treatment every person deserves, no matter who they are or where they come from. But he also knows something else. He has power. Not the kind of power that comes from arrogance, but the kind that comes from hard work, influence, and connections. And right now, he's ready to use it. The gate area is buzzing with activity. Passengers shuffle past, some glancing curiously at the scene unfolding before them. A few whisper to each other, speculating about what's going on. "What's happening?" One traveler asks another. "Looks like he's being denied boarding," comes the hushed reply. The tension in the air is palpable, and the man can feel all eyes on him. Normally, he'd try to avoid drawing attention to himself, but today, he doesn't care. This moment feels too important to let slide. He scrolls through his contacts, his fingers moving quickly but deliberately. There's one name on his list that could turn this situation around, a person who holds significant sway over the airline. Someone who owes him more than just a favor. As the phone rings, the man locks eyes with the supervisor, who suddenly seems uneasy. Maybe they sense that something big is about to happen, or maybe they're starting to realize they've underestimated this passenger. On the other end of the line, a familiar voice answers, "Hello." "Hey, it's me," the man says, cutting straight to the point. His tone is calm, but there's an edge to it, a quiet intensity that demands attention. "Listen, I need you to hear me out. Right now, I'm at your airport, standing at the gate for a flight I paid top dollar for, first class. But apparently, your team thinks my ticket doesn't mean much because they're refusing to let me board. They even threatened to kick me off the plane entirely." There's a pause on the other end. Then, a hesitant response. "Wait, what? Are you serious?" "Oh, I'm very serious," the man replies, his voice steady but firm. "And here's the deal. You know that partnership we signed last month? The one that's supposed to bring millions into your company? Well, consider it on hold until this gets fixed. Immediately." The words hang in the air, heavy with implication. On the other end of the call, the listener knows exactly how serious this is. This isn't just any client. This is someone whose business could make or break their company. Losing this partnership would be catastrophic, not just financially, but reputationally. Word spreads fast in industries like theirs, and no one wants to be known as the company that alienated one of its biggest partners. Back at the gate, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. Within minutes, the supervisor receives a frantic call. Their demeanor changes instantly. They're no longer dismissive or defensive. Instead, they practically sprint over to the man, apologizing profusely and assuring him that everything will be resolved. "Sir, please, allow us to fix this for you," they plead, sweat forming on their brow. "We'll get you seated in first class right away." But the man isn't satisfied yet. He's been disrespected, humiliated in front of dozens of strangers, and he's not about to let it slide with a simple apology. Calmly, he looks at the supervisor and says, "This isn't just about me. What happens when the next person shows up and faces the same thing? Do you think everyone has someone powerful to call? Does justice only exist for those with connections?" The supervisor stammers, unsure how to respond. Meanwhile, passengers nearby start clapping softly, showing their support. Some nod approvingly, while others exchange knowing glances. The man's courage has struck a chord with them, reminding them of times when they too may have faced unfair treatment. As the supervisor scrambles to reinstate his reservation, the man takes a moment to collect himself. He knows this victory is temporary. It won't erase the sting of discrimination or the countless others who face similar situations without the resources to fight back. But it's a start. For now, he boards the plane, taking his rightful place in first class. The cabin crew greets him warmly, almost overly so, as if trying to compensate for the earlier debacle. Sitting in his seat, he pulls out his phone again. This time, he types a quick message. "We need to talk. Tomorrow morning, my office." He hits send, knowing full well that this conversation is far from over. Tomorrow, he'll demand accountability not just for himself, but for everyone who deserves better. For the rest of the flight, the man stays out the window, lost in thought. Outside, clouds drift by, endless and untouchable. Inside, however, the storm is just beginning. The next morning, the man walks into his office with a sense of purpose. The sleek glass walls of his corner suite reflect the early sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the city buzzes with life, cars honking, people rushing to work, but inside, it's quiet. Too quiet. He knows the calm won't last long. Today, he's set to meet with someone who holds a lot of power in the airline industry. Someone whose decisions affect thousands of passengers every day. And today, that person is coming to him. As he settles into his chair, he glances at his phone. Notifications flood in. News outlets have picked up the story from yesterday. Social media is ablaze with hashtags like #FirstClassJustice and #RespectForAllPassengers. People are sharing their own experiences of being treated unfairly at airports, recounting moments when they felt small, invisible, or outright disrespected because of how they looked or sounded. The man scrolls through some of the posts, his jaw tightening as he reads stories eerily similar to his own. He closes the app and takes a deep breath. This isn't just about him anymore. It's about all those voices clamoring to be heard, all those faces that don't often get seen in boardrooms or on news channels. He knows what he has to do. But first, he needs answers and accountability. A knock on the door pulls him out of his thoughts. Standing there is the CEO of the airline, visibly nervous. The man gestures for him to sit down, offering a polite but firm smile. "Thanks for coming," he says, leaning back in his chair. His tone is measured, professional, but there's an underlying sharpness that makes it clear this isn't going to be a casual chat. The airline CEO nods, clutching a folder tightly in his hands. "Thank you for seeing me," he replies, his voice tinged with unease. "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened yesterday. It was unacceptable, and I assure you, we're taking steps to ensure it never happens again." The man raises an eyebrow. "Steps? What kind of steps?" "Well," the CEO hesitates, fumbling with the folder. "We've already suspended the employees involved pending further investigation. We're also reviewing our policies around customer service and diversity training. It's a wake-up call for us." The man listens carefully, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he leans forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Let me ask you something," he says, his voice steady but cutting. "Do you think suspending a couple of employees fixes the problem? Or does it just make it look like you're doing something while the system stays the same?" The CEO blinks, caught off guard by the directness of the question. I understand your point," he stammers. "But these things take time. Change doesn't happen overnight." "True," the man says, nodding slowly. "But here's the thing, you had plenty of time before this happened. Plenty of chances to address issues like this. Instead, nothing changed until someone with influence called you out. Until it hit your bottom line. So forgive me if I'm not convinced by promises of time and reviews." The room falls silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The CEO shifts uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unsure of what to say next. Finally, he clears his throat. "Look, I know we messed up. Big time. And I'm here because I want to make it right. Tell me what you need from us." The man studies him for a moment, weighing his words. Then he speaks, each sentence deliberate and clear. "First, I want a public acknowledgement of what happened, not just a generic apology buried in a press release, but a real statement addressing the discrimination I faced. Second, I want assurances that the employees involved will face consequences beyond temporary suspension. Third, I want a commitment to auditing your practices nationwide, not just diversity training, but real action to root out systemic biases within your workforce." He pauses, letting the weight of his demands sink in. And finally, he adds, "If any of this doesn't happen, if I see even one sign that you're dragging your feet, I'll pull our partnership. Completely. No second chances." The CEO swallows hard, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He knows the stakes. Losing this partnership would mean losing millions in revenue, not to mention the PR nightmare that would follow. Nodding slowly, he agrees. "You have my word. We'll do everything you've asked." The man sits back in his chair, satisfied for now. But he knows words are cheap. Promises are easy to make. Keeping them is another story entirely. As the CEO leaves his office, the man picks up his phone and types a quick email to his legal team. He wants documentation of everything discussed today, along with regular updates on the airline's progress. Trust, after all, has to be earned. Later that afternoon, the airline releases a public statement acknowledging the incident. It's brief but pointed, admitting fault and outlining steps they plan to take to prevent future occurrences. Social media lights up again, this time with mixed reactions. Some praise the man for standing up and forcing accountability. Others criticize him for using his influence to push his agenda. To the man, though, none of that matters. What matters is creating change, real, lasting change, that goes beyond headlines and hashtags. As he looks out the window once more, watching the city below, he allows himself a small smile. Yesterday, he was just another passenger trying to catch a flight. Today, he's become a catalyst for something bigger. Something that could reshape how people are treated, not just on planes, but everywhere. The fallout from the incident spread like wildfire. Within hours of the airline's public apology, news outlets were dissecting every detail. Talk shows debated whether the man had overstepped by leveraging his influence, while others argued that he was simply holding a powerful company accountable for its actions. Social media became a battleground of opinions, with hashtags trending globally. For many, it was a moment of reckoning, a chance to talk openly about discrimination and bias in everyday life. Back at the airline headquarters, chaos reigned. Employees scrambled to address the wave of criticism pouring in from all directions. Customer service lines lit up with calls from angry passengers who shared their own stories of mistreatment. One woman recounted being asked multiple times to prove her ticket was valid, even though she was seated comfortably in business class. A young college student described how gate agents refused to believe he belonged in first class despite showing his boarding pass repeatedly. These stories weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a deeper issue. Meanwhile, the CEO found himself drowning in meetings with senior executives, PR teams, and legal advisors. Every decision felt like walking on eggshells. "We need to act fast," one executive urged during an emergency strategy session. "If we don't show tangible progress, this could spiral out of control." Another chimed in, "And we can't afford to lose any more high-profile clients, not after what just happened." But fixing decades-old problems isn't easy, especially when those problems are woven into the fabric of an organization. The diversity training programs they promised, that existed on paper but were rarely enforced. The audits of customer service practices, more often than not, they skimmed the surface without addressing root causes. It wasn't enough to slap a band-aid on the situation, they needed surgery. For the man at the center of the storm, things weren't much calmer. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers thanking him for shining a light on an issue so many had silently endured. Some reached out with offers to collaborate, to help amplify voices that had long been ignored. He spent hours responding, connecting, and brainstorming ways to keep the momentum going. This wasn't just about one airline anymore, it was about sparking a movement. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, exhaustion hit him hard. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the past few days was fading, leaving behind a mix of emotions: pride, frustration, and a lingering sadness. Pride because he'd stood up for himself and inspired others to do the same. Frustration because he knew the fight was far from over. And sadness because no one should have to go through what he, and countless others, had experienced. His thoughts drifted back to the flight. He remembered the awkward silence of the cabin crew as they served him drinks, their forced smiles betraying unease. He thought about the other passengers watching the drama unfold at the gate, some cheering quietly, others indifferent. What would they say if they knew the full story? Would they care? Or would they scroll past headlines, shrugging off yet another tale of injustice? Determined not to let doubt creep in, he picked up his laptop and opened a blank document. Over the next hour, he drafted a plan, a blueprint for change that went beyond the airline industry. He envisioned partnerships with advocacy groups, workshops designed to educate employees across sectors, and campaigns aimed at empowering travelers to speak up when treated unfairly. It was ambitious, maybe even unrealistic, but it gave him hope. The following week, he held a press conference. Cameras flashed as reporters fired questions from every angle. "Do you think this will lead to real change?" one asked. "Are you worried about backlash?" another pressed. He answered each question calmly, emphasizing that this was only the beginning. "This isn't about revenge or punishment," he said firmly. "It's about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, where no one has to call someone powerful to get justice." As the conference wrapped up, he stepped away from the podium, feeling both drained and invigorated. Outside, supporters gathered, holding signs that read "Fair treatment for all" and "Accountability matters." Among them were people who had traveled miles to share their stories, hoping their voices might finally be heard. That night, as he drove home, the city lights blurred together in streaks of gold and red. He thought about the road ahead, the challenges, the resistance, the victories yet to come. But most of all, he thought about the ripple effect. One moment of courage had sparked a conversation. Now it was up to everyone else to carry the torch forward. Change never came easily, but it always started somewhere. And for now, that somewhere was here. The days turned into weeks, and the man found himself at the center of a whirlwind he hadn't fully anticipated. What started as a personal confrontation with an airline had grown into something much bigger, a national conversation about fairness, respect, and accountability in spaces where people from all walks of life interact daily. For him, it wasn't just about being heard anymore. It was about making sure others didn't have to shout to be seen. Every morning began with a flood of emails. Some were messages of gratitude from strangers who felt emboldened by his actions. Others came from advocacy groups eager to partner with him, hoping to channel the momentum into lasting change. There were also critics, people accusing him of grandstanding or using his influence unfairly, but he brushed those off. He knew not everyone would agree with how he handled things, but that didn't matter. What mattered was progress. One afternoon, he sat across from a group of civil rights leaders in a small conference room at his office. The air was thick with determination as they discussed strategies to tackle systemic biases in industries beyond aviation. One woman leaned forward, her voice steady but passionate. "This isn't just about airlines," she said. "It's about hotels turning away guests because of their names, restaurants seating people based on stereotypes, banks denying loans to entrepreneurs of color. These systems are interconnected, and we need to address them holistically." He nodded, absorbing her words. She was right. The incident with the airline was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. If real change was going to happen, it couldn't stop at one company or one industry. It needed to ripple outward, touching every corner of society where inequality thrived. Together, they outlined a plan. Workshops would be organized for employees in customer-facing roles, not the usual checkbox diversity training, but immersive programs that forced participants to confront their own biases. Campaigns would launch online, encouraging travelers to report incidents of discrimination anonymously so patterns could be identified and addressed. And partnerships would form between corporations and grassroots organizations to ensure accountability extended beyond corporate boardrooms. Meanwhile, the airline was scrambling to keep up with its promises. They rolled out new policies, revamped training modules, and even appointed a chief equity officer to oversee reforms. But the man stayed vigilant, knowing that change often looked good on paper but faltered in practice. Every few weeks, he'd check in with his legal team to review updates from the airline. Were they actually auditing their practices? Were employees being held accountable? Or was this just another PR stunt? To test the waters, he booked another flight with the same airline, not in first class this time, but in economy. He wanted to see if the changes reached beyond VIP treatment. From the moment he stepped into the terminal, he noticed subtle differences. Gate agents greeted passengers warmly, regardless of appearance. Cabin crew members seemed more attentive, less robotic. When he boarded the plane, a flight attendant smiled genuinely and thanked him for choosing their airline. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Still, he knew better than to celebrate too soon. Real change took time, effort, and constant vigilance. History had shown him, and countless others, that progress could easily slip backward without sustained pressure. So he kept pushing. Publicly, he praised the airline for taking steps in the right direction, but privately, he reminded them that trust was earned, not given. As months passed, the story continued to evolve. Other companies began reaching out, asking for advice on how to avoid similar missteps. Hotels, rental car agencies, and even tech firms sought guidance on creating inclusive environments for both customers and employees. To some, it might have seemed like the man had become an accidental expert on equity, but he saw it differently. He wasn't teaching anyone anything new, he was simply amplifying truths that many already knew but few dared to act on. His work spilled over into his personal life too. Friends joked that he'd become a magnet for stories of injustice, as if people instinctively trusted him to listen and care. At dinner parties, acquaintances would pull him aside to share their frustrations about rude store clerks, dismissive doctors, or landlords who made snap judgments based on race or accent. Each story weighed on him, reminding him why he couldn't afford to slow down. Late one night, as he sat alone in his living room flipping through notes from recent meetings, he paused to reflect. The journey had been exhausting, exhilarating, and humbling all at once. He thought about the faces of the people he'd met along the way, the ones who had whispered thank you after sharing their pain, the ones who had stood beside him holding protest signs, and even the ones who had criticized him harshly but pushed him to think deeper. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Change was messy, imperfect, and often painfully slow, but it was happening. People were talking. Companies were listening. Policies were shifting. None of it was enough, not yet, but it was a foundation, a starting point. As he turned off the lamp and headed to bed, he reminded himself of something simple but profound. Justice didn't belong to the powerful, it belonged to everyone. And sometimes, all it took was one person standing firm to remind the world of that truth. His work spilled over into his personal life too. Friends joked that he'd become a magnet for stories of injustice, as if people instinctively trusted him to listen and care. At dinner parties, acquaintances would pull him aside to share their frustrations about rude store clerks, dismissive doctors, or landlords who made snap judgments based on race or accent. Each story weighed on him, reminding him why he couldn't afford to slow down. Late one night, as he sat alone in his living room, flipping through notes from recent meetings, he paused to reflect. The journey had been exhausting, exhilarating, and humbling all at once. He thought about the faces of the people he'd met along the way, the ones who had whispered thank you after sharing their pain, the ones who had stood beside him holding protest signs, and even the ones who had criticized him harshly but pushed him to think deeper. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Change was messy, imperfect, and often painfully slow, but it was happening. People were talking. Companies were listening. Policies were shifting. None of it was enough, not yet, but it was a foundation, a starting point. As he turned off the lamp and headed to bed, he reminded himself of something simple but profound. Justice didn't belong to the powerful, it belonged to everyone. And sometimes, all it took was one person standing firm to remind the world of that truth. Months had passed since the incident at the airport, and life for the man had taken on a new rhythm. The initial chaos had settled into something steadier, but the weight of responsibility still lingered. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a symbol, a face attached to a movement that refused to be ignored. Every decision he made now carried meaning, not just for his company, but for the countless people watching and hoping for change. The airline, desperate to rebuild its reputation, continued rolling out reforms. They launched advertising campaigns featuring diverse passengers with taglines like, "Everyone belongs here," and "Your journey matters." Their social media feeds were filled with testimonials from employees sharing how the training programs had opened their eyes to unconscious biases. Some critics dismissed it as performative, while others praised the effort as genuine progress. The man kept a close eye on everything, knowing that actions spoke louder than words. But it wasn't just about the airline anymore. His bold stand had inspired other industries to take a hard look at themselves. Hotels began revising check-in protocols after reports surfaced of guests being turned away due to racial profiling. Ride-sharing apps introduced stricter accountability measures for drivers who canceled rides based on discriminatory reasons. Even retail stores started implementing policies to ensure fair treatment of shoppers regardless of appearance or background. It was as if his single act of defiance had cracked open a door that couldn't be closed again. Still, the man knew better than to let himself get swept up in the praise. He'd seen too many movements lose steam when the spotlight shifted elsewhere. So he stayed grounded, focusing on what mattered most, real impact. He spent hours meeting with advocacy groups, brainstorming ways to keep the momentum alive. One idea they landed on was creating a platform where travelers could share their experiences, good and bad, without fear of retaliation. Think of it as Yelp for fairness, where companies would be rated not just on service, but on inclusivity. If enough people used it, businesses would have no choice but to listen. To test the concept, he partnered with a tech startup to develop the app. It wasn't easy. Coding glitches, funding hurdles, and disagreements over features delayed the launch several times, but eventually it went live. Within days, thousands of users downloaded it, flooding the system with reviews. Some praise airlines for going above and beyond to accommodate families with young children. Others called out restaurants for seating white patrons before black ones, even when the latter arrived first. Each review added another layer to the conversation, shining a light on areas that needed improvement. As the platform gained traction, so did the backlash. A few companies accused him of trying to ruin their reputations, claiming the app was biased against them. Online trolls targeted him, posting hateful comments and questioning his motives. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he doing too much? Pushing too hard? But then he'd scroll through the positive feedback, the heartfelt messages from people saying the app gave them a voice, and he'd remind himself why he started this journey in the first place. One evening, he attended a community event hosted by a local advocacy group. The room buzzed with energy as speakers shared stories of triumph and resilience. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, and looked out at the sea of faces. Some belonged to strangers, others to friends he'd made along the way. All of them were united by a shared desire for justice. "I never set out to be the guy standing in front of you today," he began, his voice steady but warm. "I didn't plan to call anyone out or start a movement. I just wanted to board a plane without feeling like I didn't belong. But sometimes, life pushes us into moments we can't ignore. Moments that force us to choose between silence and action." He paused, letting the words sink in. "What happened to me wasn't unique. Far from it. People deal with stuff like that every single day. The difference is, not everyone has someone powerful to call. Not everyone gets listened to when they speak up. And that's why we're here, to make sure those voices are heard. To make sure no one feels small or invisible ever again." The crowd erupted into applause, cheering loudly as he stepped off the stage. As he mingled afterward, shaking hands and exchanging hugs, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about connection. About reminding people that they weren't alone. Later that night, driving home under a sky dotted with stars, he reflected on how far he'd come. From that tense moment at the gate to the ripple effect spreading across industries, it had been a wild ride. There were still battles to fight, obstacles to overcome, and skeptics to win over. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, the world was inching closer to becoming a place where fairness wasn't the exception, it was the rule. The men's journey had come full circle, but it wasn't the kind of ending wrapped neatly in a bow. Instead, it was more like the start of something bigger, something he couldn't fully control or predict. Life had taught him that change didn't happen overnight, and victories were rarely final. But what he'd accomplished so far was proof that standing up for yourself could spark a chain reaction, inspiring others to do the same. By now, his story had become part of the cultural fabric. News outlets revisited it periodically, framing it as a turning point in how companies approached customer service and inclusivity. Documentaries featured interviews with people who had faced similar discrimination, using his experience as a lens to explore broader societal issues. Even late-night talk show hosts joked about it, though their humor carried an undertone of respect. "If you mess with this guy," one quipped during a monologue, "you might as well shut down your airline." But behind the headlines and jokes, real shifts were happening. The app he helped create gained traction worldwide, becoming a tool not just for travelers, but for anyone seeking accountability. Businesses scrambled to improve their ratings, knowing that poor reviews could hurt them more than angry tweets ever could. Employees started speaking up too, reporting unfair practices within their own workplaces. It was no longer just about customers demanding respect, it was about workers insisting on dignity as well. One day, while scrolling through the app's feedback section, the man stumbled upon a review that stopped him cold. A young woman wrote about her recent flight, describing how she'd been upgraded to first class after the airline staff recognized her from a previous incident where she'd been treated poorly. She ended her post with a simple sentence: "For the first time, I felt seen." He read it over and over, each word sinking deeper into his chest. That was why he'd done all this, not for fame or revenge, but for moments like these. Moments when someone felt valued, respected, and human. Still, the road ahead wasn't without its challenges. Some critics argued that focusing on individual stories let institutions off the hook, shifting blame onto low-level employees instead of addressing systemic problems. Others accused him of being overly idealistic, saying true equality required policy changes at a government level, not just corporate reforms. He agreed with some of their points but disagreed with others. Yes, laws mattered. Yes, systems needed to be dismantled and rebuilt. But personal accountability mattered too. Change often started small, with one person deciding they wouldn't stay silent anymore. To keep the momentum going, he began hosting town halls across the country, inviting everyday people to share their experiences and ideas. In Chicago, a grandmother talked about being denied entry to a hotel because of her accent. In Miami, a college student described being followed around a store by security guards who assumed she was shoplifting. In Seattle, a disabled veteran shared how difficult it was to navigate airports without proper accommodations. Each story added fuel to the fire, reminding everyone present, including himself, that the fight wasn't over. At one of these events, a teenage girl approached him after the cue and a session. Her hands trembled as she held out a notebook. "Can I get your autograph?" she asked shyly. He smiled, signing the page before asking what inspired her to attend. She hesitated, then said, "My mom always tells me to speak up if something feels wrong, but I never really believed it would make a difference. Hearing your story made me think maybe it does." Her words stayed with him long after the event ended. They reminded him of his younger self, the version of him who used to doubt whether standing up for himself was worth the effort. Back then, he didn't have anyone powerful to call either. All he had was determination and hope. Now he realized he'd become that powerful person for someone else, not because of his title or wealth, but because he chose to use his voice. As months turned into years, the man scaled back his public appearances, letting newer voices take center stage. He knew movements thrived when leadership rotated, giving fresh perspectives room to grow. Still, he remained involved, quietly supporting initiatives and mentoring young activists eager to learn. His office walls were covered with photos from rallies, letters from supporters, and awards recognizing his contributions. Yet none of those trophies meant as much to him as the quiet moments, like receiving an email from a stranger thanking him for giving them courage to confront their boss about unfair treatment. One crisp autumn morning, he found himself sitting on a park bench, watching leaves swirl in the breeze. Beside him sat a cup of coffee, steam curling upward. For the first time in ages, he allowed himself to sit still, to breathe deeply, and to appreciate how far things had come. The world wasn't perfect. It likely never would be. But it was undeniably different. People were talking openly about issues they once whispered about. Companies were being forced to listen. And somewhere along the way, the idea of fairness had shifted from a distant dream to an achievable goal. He thought about the airport again, the place where it all began. Funny how such a mundane setting could spark such extraordinary change. Funny how one moment of defiance could ripple outward, touching lives he'd never meet. As he sipped his coffee, he smiled softly, feeling a mix of pride and peace. Justice wasn't something you achieved alone, it was something you built together. And for the first time in a long time, he believed the world was ready to build.